evening and welcome to our special discussion right here on TV1. We're discussing about Sri Lanka's reconciliation efforts. We're talking about Sri Lanka's accountability issues. How must Sri Lanka move forward in these two fronts? We are quite aware that many contradictions have been made with regard to including foreign judges in the accountability process in Sri Lanka. What is the best way out for a country like Sri Lanka? 2009, we saw the end of the conflict. 7 years after the end of the conflict, where is the country standing today? To discuss all this and more, I have a special guest in the studio this evening. He is Mr. Ronald C. Sly, Professor of Law from Seattle University. He was also a part of the Kenyan Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission as well. Who else can talk about reconciliation and accountability issues than Professor Sly? A very good evening to you.
Good evening.
Welcome to the show, Professor. Starting off, tell us a little bit about the way in which Sri Lanka should move forward 7 years following the end of the conflict in terms of reconciliation and accountability.
Sure. Well, first of all, let me say I'm not an expert in Sri Lankan history or the contemporary situation in Sri Lanka. But I do think it's very important that as you grapple with how to deal with a past that involved ethnic conflict, gross violations of human rights, towards a culture of accountability, reconciliation, reparations, and the rule of law, it's very important that Sri Lanka be deliberate about how they go about that process. And I think one way to view it is to focus on the importance of understanding the truth of what happened, because without understanding the truth about what happened in the past, there's no way you can have any form of justice, and without justice, there's no way you're going to have any form of reconciliation. And that's the lesson that one can learn from, whether it's Kenya, South Africa, or other places that have gone through similar transitions.
Professor Sly, you are part of the Kenyan Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission as well. What were the problems you all faced?
Well, the Kenya Truth Commission was established after the post-election violence in 2007, but the mandate that we were given was much broader than that violence. So we were asked to look at human rights violations very broadly defined. So not just violations of civil and political rights, not just killings, massacres, rapes, tortures, but also violations of socioeconomic rights. And we were to look at those from Kenyan independence, so 1963 until the end of February 2008, when the post-election violence ended. And the idea there was to try and understand what were the systemic, institutional elements that led to a disputed election almost erupting into violence. The Kenyans believed, which I think was right, was that because of their history of colonialism, as well as the history of their own human rights violations committed by their own governments, that they have a lot of unsolved mysteries in terms of disappearances, in terms of assassinations, in terms of who was responsible for certain massacres, and then without really grappling with those and understanding what had happened, as well as, to the extent that one could, holding the individuals responsible, accountable, they would never be able to move forward. And political differences in the future would then also lead to violence.
Professor Sly, how important is it to have a homegrown solution, a homegrown system to address issues of reconciliation and even accountability for that matter?
I think it's incredibly important. I think Sri Lanka, like any society going through a process like this, needs to own that process. I think there are important things that one can learn from other countries. There are important things that one can learn from the international community. But I think one needs to view those lessons critically. What worked in one place doesn't necessarily work in another place. So one could look to Kenya or South Africa or other countries and perhaps adapt things that they use, but that can only be done if they're critically assessed and if they're adapted to make sense within a Sri Lankan context.
Professor, you said that international experience, taking into account international experience, is very important in terms of accountability as well as reconciliation. However, the international community right now are exerting a lot of pressure on Sri Lanka to incorporate or include foreign judges in our system, in our judicial system. Is this going to work?
Well, I think only you in Sri Lanka can answer how well it might work. I can understand why the international community might want that. Let me maybe say a little bit about Kenya and its use of foreign individuals in the Truth Commission as well as other processes that were undertaken there. One of the problems in Kenya was that because of the history of abuses in that country, there was a lot of distrust among many different sectors of Kenya with the government. And so there was a sense that having foreigners as part of the process, but not dominating the process, would actually increase legitimacy and increase trust between the government and those populations. So I was one of 3 international commissioners on a 9-person commission. We were a minority. We didn't have veto power over anything. But we were very actively involved in every step of the process. And because of our presence, there were people within Kenya that had trust in the institution and that engaged with us that otherwise would not have. I don't know whether that's the case in Sri Lanka or not, but I think there are there's a lot of expertise. I think there are a lot of lessons that people from other parts of the world could bring to Sri Lanka. But again, I think it's very important that the process be of and by and for Sri Lankans, that Sri Lankans critically assess what those lessons are, and at the end of the day, the Sri Lankans control whatever that process is.
Professor, you spoke about the Kenyan Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission. I want to drag your attention to the South African Truth Commission that was established as well, which is the stepping stone, or many Sri Lankans aspire to move forward on this premise. However, there are those who point to the many shortcomings in the South African process as well. They say the problems that are reflected even now in South Africa was a result of this South African Truth Commission. How do you view this comment or view?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that the problem South Africa is facing today is because of the Truth Commission, but I think what some of my South African friends will say is that because of the Truth Commission's failure to look at certain violations, to place the violations of apartheid within a larger socioeconomic context, that country now is still grappling with issues of corruption, accountability, racism, economic inequality that it otherwise might not have. We'll never know whether, if the Truth Commission had done something differently, whether South Africa today would look different. But I do think it's right to say that that one of the reasons that South Africa is facing some of the challenges that it has is its failure to look at some of those larger systemic institutional issues that underlay apartheid and that still exist in South Africa.
There have been cases as well as allegations of sexual violence during the armed conflicts in Sri Lanka, Professor Sly. During the transitional justice process, what needs to be done to help these victims?
Well, I think there are a number of things. I think, number one, one needs to document what happened in terms of sexual violence, as well as provide an opportunity for those who are victims of sexual violence to tell their stories. And that's a very difficult and sensitive thing. What we did in Kenya is we created women's only hearings where only women were present, only women commissioners and staff were present, to provide a safe space for women to come forward and talk about the violations that had happened to them or that they had witnessed. And through that, we were able to document a large number of violations of women, including violations of sexual violence. I think the other thing that's really important is to provide some form of reparations. And reparations is not just or only monetary reparations, but also psychosocial assistance and other sort of community-oriented reparations with respect to sexual violence or other sorts of violations that occurred during the conflict.
Professor, many say that the scars left behind by the conflict should not be open. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think, I think that's a common view that some can have. I think both Victims sometimes feel that way. They don't want to revisit something that happened in the past, as well as perpetrators who obviously have their own self-interest and not wanting to unearth what they had done in the past. I think the reality is that if one doesn't deal with those sorts of histories, they will come back to haunt the countries. And you see that time and again throughout the world, whether you look at Latin America, where, for example, in Argentina and Chile, there was initially an amnesty to stop any form of accountability for the violations that occurred during the conflicts in those countries. And a few decades later, the governments are now overturning those amnesties. They're reopening those wounds because they've realized that not only victims, but many people in those societies need some sort of vehicle for addressing, for providing some sort of closure to what happened in the past. And so I think if things are just swept under the rug, eventually the rug will be revealed and these issues will have to be dealt with. So the sooner that they can be dealt with, usually the better.
Do you think the government is on the right track?
I think my understanding is yes. I think there are a number of initiatives that are being undertaken. What I would say is what I'm starting to learn in Sri Lanka is that there's a lack of coordination and a lack of communication about what the plan is with respect to a wide variety of different efforts. So you're undertaking constitutional reforms, you're undertaking different efforts on reconciliation, there's an Office of Missing Persons that it's about to be established. But I don't get a sense that there's a clear sense of how all of these mechanisms will work together. And more importantly, there's not a clear sense to the public for them to understand what the purpose is of each of these efforts.
Professor, addressing a Colombo-based audience during the Neelam Thiruchallam Trust Memorial lecture which was organized by the NTT, you said there are 6 different institutions working on reconciliation in Sri Lanka. Does this apply when you said that lack of coordination and collaboration in the part of the government to move forward to establish reconciliation?
Well, yes, and I don't know enough about the history of why those 6 different organizations were created, and there may be good reasons that there are 6 organizations. But I think that one risks, if there are 6 organizations dealing in this case with reconciliation, or you could talk about whether it's accountability or reparations or whatever the thing may be, that you're more likely to have people be confused about, well, what if I'm interested in reconciliation, or I want to help?
How would you advise the government, Professor Lai?
How would I what?
Advise the government.
Well, I think what's important is to then rationalize why there are 6 organizations. Why is it that there are 6 different organizations, and what are their individual purposes? And if there's a coherence to them, then make that public, explain that to individuals, and if not, there might be ways to make the process more efficient. But I think it's very important for the government to communicate with the public about what the plan is with respect to truth, reparations, accountability, reconciliation, in a way that makes sense. Too often, and this was certainly true in Kenya, things can be done piecemeal. And I think if you do things piecemeal, and you do things in a very reactive way without a coherent, conscious plan about why institution A is doing X and why institution B is doing Y, then you won't succeed in any of them. And then you'll be back to square one, and then you'll have to start again to create institutions to deal with truth, to deal with accountability, to deal with reconciliation.
It appears that the transitional justice process right now in place in Sri Lanka only focuses on the north and east. And many say that the rest of the country is being ignored. What is the reason behind this, Professor? Because we see that many say, a general notion in Sri Lanka right now is that war heroes are being targeted, Sinhalese and even Muslim victims who went through the war, who were victimized because of the war, are being sidelined as well. How important is it for the government to incorporate or include the entire country in the transitional justice process?
Extremely important. I think one of the things that any sort of process like this needs to include is broad consultation and broad inclusion. And I think to the extent that there are processes that are undertaken where different communities either perceive or in fact are in reality shut out from the process, that only makes matters worse. So if there are victims or other important communities that don't see themselves as part of that process, I think that's something that should be addressed.
Professor Lai, right now, the general notion in Sri Lanka is the fact that the government is trying to please the international community. And the statements that are being made by the present government directs to the Human Rights Council sessions in the year 2017 March. Everything is targeted for next year. Do you think that the transitional justice process in Sri Lanka would fail because of this notion in mind? What is your thoughts on this? What are
you
your thoughts
mean
on this?
would fail because the government is working with the Human Rights Council?
Absolutely.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I don't think that's necessarily the case. I mean, I think the government has obviously made a decision to work with the Human Rights Council and to work with the United Nations and the international community to address the problems of historical injustice in Sri Lanka. I think what's important is to keep the power and the control of what is going to be done with the Sri Lankan government and the Sri Lankan people and not cede that to the international community. But I think the international community can play a very important part both in providing ideas, maybe providing pressure to get the government to do what it says it wants to do, which is to really address in a meaningful way these historical violations.
Professor, do you think that the government is trying to please the international community? The Human Rights Council, the West, the United States, the United Kingdom? Is it trying to please the wrong group?
Well, I don't know enough, I guess, about what the government is doing with respect to those different outside constituencies. I guess what I would say is there's nothing inherently wrong in trying to please outside constituencies. I think the question then, is that being done at the expense of addressing domestic constituencies? And if that's the case, I think that's a problem, because I think even if the government's view is that we're going to look to the outside community, to the international community, to provide the political, the legal, and the financial support for these processes without really having them embedded in and getting the political support domestically, then I think that's a recipe for failure. But on the other hand, the plan is to reach out to the international community, to use them to help support what is, at the end of the day, a Sri Lankan process, and that has the political support of various constituencies within Sri Lanka, then I think that could work quite well.
Professor, do you think that the United Nations is treating a certain group of countries differently to that of the developing country, the middle-income countries?
Yes. I think that's always been the case, unfortunately. I mean, I think the United Nations reflects international power politics. I mean, there was I was interviewed by a reporter for the New York Times recently. The U.S. State Department recently issued guidelines on transitional justice for countries like Sri Lanka and other countries in the world. And the reporter asked a very interesting and important question, which is, well, shouldn't these principles in terms of transitional justice be used in the United States when we're dealing with the legacy of slavery, when we're dealing with the legacy of discrimination in the United States? And my understanding from the reporter was that the State Department declined to answer that. But the reporter reached out to me and a number of others to ask about whether they could apply in the United States, and I think absolutely they can. And I think the United States and other countries in the North have a tendency to see quite clearly injustices that happen in other countries and to have creative ideas about how to deal with them, which might be good ideas, but have a tendency not to see the applicability of those same ideas and that same creativity within our own societies. And I think that's both a disservice to our own societies, in my case the United States, but it also leads to legitimate allegations of hypocrisy and double standards, exactly the point that you're raising in your question.
Professor, over the last few years, we've seen the manner in which human rights violations taking place in countries like Libya, in Afghanistan, in Iraq. We saw the former British Prime Minister saying that he made a mistake with Iraq. However, we saw the manner in which how many people were killed during the US-led invasion in Iraq as well. Why isn't the United Nations Human Rights Council not focusing on countries like the US and the United Kingdom? And why only countries like Sri Lanka?
Well, I think the answer to that is the way the United Nations is, the structure of the United Nations. So you have the United States and the 4 other big powers that are part of the Security Council with veto power. So the United Nations is going to be hesitant to be overly critical of the United States, the UK, France, China, and Russia. Having said that, the United Nations has, when it's had an opening, has been critical of the United States with respect to Guantanamo, with respect to the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. So it's not that it's not there, but I think one can't deny the political reality of power at the global level, and that doesn't mean that what the United Nations is doing is right. One can understand it, but not justify what appears to be a double standard. I also think it's a mistake to look at that and say, well, if you're not willing or you're not able to provide justice, for example, with respect to the United States intervention in Iraq, then you shouldn't pursue justice anywhere. And I think that's a mistake. I think what we should do is pursue justice in Sri Lanka, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and in the United States. And we shouldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, that we should push accountability and push against impunity wherever we find it. And the fact that we may fail or not do as well in some places doesn't mean we shouldn't continue to push both in those places as well as in other parts of the world.
Professor, getting back to the Sri Lankan context now, many civil society organizations the world over are educating the public about the transitional justice process. But in Sri Lanka mainly, people do not have faith in NGOs or NGOs. How do you intend to change this mindset? What must the NGOs and INGOs really do when they implement educational programs, awareness programs in a country like Sri Lanka?
Well, I think and again, I'm not as familiar with the NGO community here in Sri Lanka, but I do think that NGOs in countries in which I've worked have varied in how strategic they have been in approaching processes like this. I think it's really important for civil society, for NGOs, INGOs, to be very strategic and very sophisticated about how they approach transitional justice process. And I've seen in Kenya and in other parts of the world, there's a tendency for individuals as well as organizations at times to reduce and oversimplify and to look at a particular institution, for example, that is imperfect but still has some positive aspects. And rather than throwing the baby out with the bathwater, rather than trying to disband or to criticize an institution that has both good elements and bad elements, it seems to me a more constructive approach and perhaps a more successful approach is to try and push those institutions, government institutions, independent agencies, to move in the right direction and not to say either they're completely good or completely bad. So what I would say to NGOs here in Sri Lanka is to be very actively involved in the process. I think it's crucially important for civil society and NGOs to be involved in processes like this. But I think they need to have clear strategic goals, both short-term, medium-term, and long-term, in order to determine how they should engage and what is the best way to engage.
Professor, will justice ever be achieved in Sri Lanka? Will the truth ever be surfaced on exactly what happened during the final stages of the conflict, during the last 3 decades of the conflict? Will this ever be surfaced?
Well, I think you've already seen some being surfaced, right? You've already had some commissions of inquiry. More and more information continues to come out. You've had some forms of accountability that have started, and you have processes that are being undertaken, whether it's the constitutional reform, the Office of Missing Persons, and others, the proposal for some sort of special court, whether there's foreign judges or not. right, is designed to start to provide some form of justice. So what I would say, I think it's a mistake to expect those sorts of institutions to provide all truth or to provide all justice. That can't be the standard, because that's never happened in any country in the world. What one can expect, what one can demand, is that those institutions further truth, further accountability, further reconciliation, further reparations. And if they're not doing that, then they should be criticized and maybe they should be disbanded. If they are doing that, then they should be supported and pushed further to do more and more of what they are doing with respect to whatever their mandate is.
What is the way forward for Sri Lanka? What is your message to the government?
Well, I think the message to the government is to keep doing what it's been doing, but to do it in a way that is more strategic and coherent in terms of what I understand has happened so far, that is thinking not just about constitutional reform, not just an Office of Missing Persons, but also thinking through all of the other elements of a process like this, and then most importantly, to coordinate all of them and to communicate that coordination. I think one of the challenges here in Sri Lanka, as I understand, when I talk to different people in Sri Lankan society, they have different views about what is happening, and part of that is that none of them really know exactly what is happening in government in terms of plans for some of these processes.
Thank you very much, Professor Sly, for joining us this evening on our show.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure having you on board today.
It was my pleasure. Thank you very much.